Good morning. I guess you can hear me. I can hear myself in any case. We have today somebody who really knows about plants. He lives in the heart of the Yucatan. He's traveled all over Mexico, Central, South America, and he's a true botanist. He studies primarily orchids, and he and his wife have been noticing the bromeliads that grow with those orchids in the various parts of the world. But today he's going to talk to us about bromeliads and the orchids that grow together in his garden or in other places that he has seen them in those sort of circumstances. Looking at them together in the wild would be something he may want to come back and talk to us another time. But I think you'll find it interesting what he has to say to us. So I introduced Germán Carnaveli. Germán, please.
As you already said, I am an orchid specialist, and I also have the passion for bromeliads. My wife she worked with bromeliads, primarily with hectia, but we've worked together in tilans and some other genera. But as I told you, I'm primarily an orchidologist, and I work in general like Encyclia, you may know this one here, or Caracerum, or some other orchids. So today I'm going to be talking about orchids and bromeliads. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. I can hear you.
Good. Okay. Can you understand me?
Yes.
Why is my English so weird? What's it?
It's your microphone. It's $3.
My microphone. Yeah, probably my microphone is not that good. Okay. So anyway, okay, here in Mexico, I am originally from Venezuela, and I started my research there. Then I went to the States to get my PhD, and then I tried to return to Venezuela. Well, you know what's going on in Venezuela, so lots of us went to other places to find work, and we got here into the Yucatan Peninsula in Mérida, and started doing research in neotropical orchids, bromeliads. My wife started working on hectia primarily, and I guess she's already given talks to you about hectias. And then I worked in genera that are centered in Mexico, but not necessarily restricted to Mexico, like Encyclia or Caracerum. Okay, so as I told you, I'm a specialist in the orchidaceae, and I'm used to work in the herbarium. For example, that's me working in the herbarium, and that's one. Wait, let me have this work for me. There you go. Okay, so that's me working in the herbarium, and that's one of my graduate students. She's working on any kind of plant. She's just posing for the photograph. And in the lab doing DNA work to research the relationships of orchids and bromeliads too. Or in the field, the ugliest one in this picture, that's me, all sweaty after a long day in the field. In the field where I often collect orchids or bromeliads. For example, here you have a Tillandsia variabilis collected in southeastern Quintana Roo. But I'm also an enthusiastic plant grower. I grow orchids and bromeliads. You see them growing together there in that section of my garden. I also grow other epiphytic plants and even succulents like Haworthia and Jasteria and some cacti. Okay. I often find the orchids and the bromeliads growing together in the field. That's not unusual. It's actually the rule. When I go to the field to look for my orchids, Does anybody want to say anything now? Okay. So I often find them growing together in the wild, and that's actually the rule. Whenever I find orchids, I'll find bromeliads growing together. This picture shows an orchid species and a bromeliad species growing together. That's Rincolelia dicbriana that grows in southeastern Yucatan Peninsula, and which is the national flower of Honduras, and Tilanza variabilis, that you must know very well in cultivation. Okay. So I guess we can assume that they share adaptations, common adaptations to the environment where they occur together. Here you have an epidendrum and you have tillandsias growing together. That's another Tilanza variabilis. So let's talk a little bit about those adaptations and morphological, ecological, and physiological modifications that allow them to grow together in the field that are very important for us as orchid and bromeliad growers. If we understand a few basic rules, we should be able to grow them together. And you know, you are perfectly aware of many of these rules as bromeliad growers. Which in this case, what it means is that if you grow bromeliads, you can certainly grow orchids. One thing that I want to tell you is that I know you grow your bromeliads in the San Diego area, which is rather dry. And most orchids come from more humid environments. But remember, the orchids are huge. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the orchids now. Huge in the numbers of species. And there's plenty of them that grow in dry areas that would grow very well for you there in San Diego. So I'm going to make some sort of emphasis on adaptations to grow in dry areas. And I'm going to show you lots of orchids from dry areas. Okay, this picture is taken in a tropical, humid, moist forest. But some of those orchids there will grow for you. Okay, so first, let's make a very brief introduction to the two families. I'm not gonna talk too much about bromeliads because you know bromeliads much better than I do. But so I will sort of concentrate on the orchids. Okay, the orchids, you may know, it's a cosmopolitan family. There's much more diverse in the tropics. How many orchid species are there? We don't know for certain right now. Maybe 30,000 species, 25,000 species. We're still discovering a bunch of them. It's a family that is at least 10 times as large as the bromeliads. There's maybe 15,000 to 17,000 species just in the neotropics. Something that is very interesting and very relevant to this talk is that about 3/4 of them are epiphytes. So epiphytism is going to be a main subject of many theme line of this talk. Okay, there you see a few orchids growing in the field, the environments where they are most diverse. And well, this is the place where I work. I work in the Yucatan Peninsula over here. But the orchids, what makes them different from other plants? The flowers, mostly flower character. The orchids have the reproductive organs, stamens, stigmas, fuse in a very specialized organ called the column. Then this is a column of an orchid. Here is the answer of the flower. This is a stigma of the flower where the pollen attaches itself when it's going to be pollinated. Okay, then the petal opposed to the column, in this case, is modified into a landing platform that is called a labellum. This would be an orchid labellum. So, as opposed to bromeliad flowers, the orchid flowers are bilaterally symmetric. There's only one plane of symmetry where you can cut an orchid flower into two equal sides. And it's across the dorsal sepal and the labellum. Bromeliad flowers on the other side, they have several planes of symmetry. So they're very different. Okay, then the pollen of the orchids is coherent or fused into masses that are usually called pollinia. Here you have 8 pollinia of an orchid species, a myrmecophila species. Okay. Instead, in the bromeliads, the pollen is free, it's powdery. You know that if you're trying to pollinate any bromelia. The ovary of the orchids is inferior, which means that the ovary is under the flower, not inside the flower as it is in the bromeliads. This orchid ovary is very interesting because it may have thousands or even millions of ovules. So an orchid fruit, an orchid capsule may carry 1 million, even 2 million seeds. And that's very important because remember that orchid seeds are minute, wind-borne seeds. They need to be dispersed by the wind. Then, as being so small, they have to land in a branch that has mycorrhizal association, and then they can grow there. But remember, what are the odds of a tiny little seed carried by the wind to land in the right spot? So if you produce 2 million seeds and 1 or 2 land in the right place and germinate, the plant, the fruit, did its job. So the odds are very, very small for any particular orchid seed germinating. Look at the size of this orchid seed. Less than 1 millimeter. The seed is very small. This cellular schist, or the seed coat, is full of empty seeds that allow them to be wind-borne. Okay. The orchids occupy an extraordinary various life history strategies that make them very different. They can be saprophytes. They can grow under the soil with no chlorophyll, and behave like a fungus, and only protrude from the earth, from the land, when they flower. That's the case of Rhizanthella gardneri, an orchid from Australia. But there's several others that do the same. They can be aquatic, like this Cleistis abdida from Venezuela. Some of them grow only on orchids, like this Certopodium macrobulbum from Mexico. Some of them lack leaves and stems. They're only roots, photosynthetic roots from which berries, inflorescences emerge. Other are standard epiphytes with roots, pseudobulbs, leaves, and showy flowers, like Cattleya that you may know. Others, like this Erycina glossomistax, have a life cycle that is shorter than a year. They will germinate in these tiny twigs and go from seed to flower in less than a year, which is extremely unusual for epiphytes. There's even an orchid that is insectivorous or carnivorous. There's actually probably 2 like this. We were very lucky to describe this species from the High Tepu is the Guayana Highlands in Venezuela. And these structures, these little structures here in the base of the leaf, most likely capture rotifers and other arthropods. So that was the first carnivorous orchid. Now we have probably two, and there's probably more. So you see the orchids are essentially everywhere. They don't grow in the poles, but outside of the polar Arctic lines, orchids are everywhere. They're much more diverse in the tropics, but they're everywhere. Their diversity is extraordinary. And you know that the flowers are very different from each other. There's lots of them are extremely beautiful. And that's the charm of the orchid. That's why lots of people love to grow orchids. Here you have a few of them. That's a Sigmatostalix from Ecuador. That's Prostekea garciana from Venezuela. Dracula chestertonia from Colombia. Wanchesia maguire from Venezuela. An unidentified Telepogon from Costa Rica. Dendrobium spectabilis from New Guinea. Catasetum macrocarpum from Venezuela. Dendrobium farmera from La India. That's Paphiopelum malipoense from China. Laelia anceps, which is sort of like the national flower of Mexico. And unidentified Stelis from Venezuela. Okay. And that flower diversity is coupled with novel, complex pollination strategies. The orchids are famous for that. One of the best known examples is the case of the stars of Bethlehem from Madagascar that was discovered in Madagascar, and Charles Darwin predicted that there should be a hawk moth with a proboscis long enough to reach the bottom of the 70 centimeters long spur. And botanists, biologists at that time laughed at him. But the moth was eventually discovered and was named Santopan morgani predicta because Darwin had predicted. Okay, but then you see lots of them are pollinated by several species of bees that they trick into visiting the flowers. Most orchid flowers don't offer anything. Not pollen, not oil or nectar. They just deceive the pollinator. That's essentially the rule in the orchidaceae. Pollen is packed, as I told you, in masses that we call pollinia, which are set on complex structures called pollinaria. And the pollinaria attached in very specific places of the pollinators. So look at all the diversity of pollinaria here that are adapted or have evolved to attach to several kinds of pollinators. That's very distinctive of the orchidaceae, and that's not found in any other plant family with the exception of some Apocynaceae of the Asclepiadoides subfamily that also have pollinia and pollinaria. But the homology, so the structure of those pollinaria are very, very different from this. Okay. Orchid seeds are very small, tiny, I already told you those. These are electron microscope images of them, and you can say they're very small. This round family, this round seed here is a vanilla seed. Vanilla has very different seeds from the rest of the orchids, but most 99% of the orchids have seeds like this, fusiform, very tiny, and wind-borne. Look at all the seeds that this fruit, that's an orchid, that's a Cattleya seed, seed pod. It has several thousand seeds inside. Okay. Another very important adaptation to epiphytism is the velamen. Velamen is tissue made up of dead cells that are empty and act like a sponge that allows the orchids and other plants that have it to collect water very quickly. So one of the reasons why the orchids have been so successful is because they have these velaminous roots. That's a transversal section of an orchid root. And this section, the outer section, is the velamen, which acts like a sponge. Here you see orchid roots in several versions. Bromeliads with these thick white velaminous roots. This is one of those orchids that don't have leaves nor stems, just photosynthetic roots. This actually has very showy flowers, Kiloschista lunifera. That's from Thailand. Some orchids produce these erectly growing roots that make like a waste basket that collect debris and water and allow the plants to collect nutrients. What about the economical importance of the orchids? Well, I suppose most orchids are known because of the beauty of the flower, but some of them are important because of other uses. And of course, the most important of them all is vanilla. The vanilla fragrance is extracted mainly from this species, Vanilla planifolia. There's like 2 or 3 other species that will also have the fragrance. And, many people don't know that the vanilla is an orchid. It's not interesting that it's an orchid. It's the only orchids that it's a climber. It's a vine. So it's a very interesting plant. Then around the Mediterranean area in Northern Africa and Southern Europe, you have several orchid genera that have tubers at the base of the plant that survive the dry season or the winter in this case. And those tubercles are called tuberoids, and they're collected, dried and grinded, and they extract a product that they call salep that is supposed to cure all sorts of ailments, including some that are not polite to mention in this talk. Okay. Here in the neotropics, some orchids like the Syrtopodium, they collect the pseudobulbs, they grind them, and they extract glue from them. So that's another of the few other uses that orchids have. But orchids are known because of this, the beauty of the flowers. They are cultivated everywhere by all sorts of people, including people that grow bromeliads. Look at the beauty of the flowers of the orchids. These are several genera or several of the main group of orchids. Probably the best known are these dendrobiums or the phalaenopsis that aren't featured here, but are featured here. Cattleillas, of course, vandas and related species or groups, Paphiopedilum, and many other orchid groups that are widely cultivated. Most of them you can grow along with the bromeliads. But they're not only grown because of the beauty of the flowers. Some of them, like bromeliads, also have beautiful leaves, beautiful foliage. And here is a sample of them. There's species from Asia, Macodes, for example, or from the neotropics, Sarcoglottis and Cyclopogon. From Africa, like Oeseoclades, and several others. There's plenty of orchids with beautiful leaves that deserve to be grown mainly because of the leaves. And some orchids are almost perfect. like Paphiopterygiums, because most of them have both beautiful foliage and beautiful leaves, flowers. Okay. They are so beautiful that in many places of the world, they have been selected, they have been picked to be the national flowers of countries or of states in the United States. For example, the national flower of Belize is Prosticea cocleata. Well, there's no feature here. But for example, Brazil has chosen Cattleya purpurata as its national flower. And Costa Rica has Guariantes Kennedy, the guaria, as its national flower. Panama has Peristeria elata, the non-flower, as the dove orchid, as its national flower. This is the national flower of Venezuela, my country, Cattleya mossia, which is widely cultivated. This is the national flower of Belize, Lincodelia digdiana. And at least one state in the United States, Minnesota, has chosen an orchid, a terrestrial orchid in this case, Cypripedium reginae, the show-related slipper, as its state flower. Okay, so I'm not going to talk as extensively about the bromeliads because you know bromeliads much better than I do. That's Tillandsia haguacalensis, the one that is there. And what's interesting about the Bromeliaceae, besides the fact that they're very beautiful and widely cultivated, the Bromeliaceae are, from the botanical point of view, the largest plant family which is totally endemic to the neotropics, or almost endemic. There's a single species of bromeliad, a Picernia feliciana, that grows in Western Africa. But all of the other 55 or 60 genera, the number of genera keeps changing because they change the circumscription of the genera. They recently split Cryptanthus into several genera, for example. And nobody knows what's going to happen with Acmea. There's going to be either a monster genus with thousands of species or many genera with fewer species. And, there's probably about 3,500 bromeliad species. We keep adding new species to the family. We recently described a new species of Androlepis, for example. That's not featured here. Some other plant families are also endemic to the neotropics, and the most famous of them all is the Cactaceae. That is also widely grown in many places in the world, and they are commonly grown there in San Diego too. That's Cossiemia jacensi from Sonora. It probably grows in southern Arizona too. There's other plant families that are endemic to the neotropics. One of them is the Diaprobatiaceae, and there's many more. I chose to present these two, to feature these two, because they are closely related to the Bromeliaceae, particularly the Bromeliaceae, which is almost endemic to the Guayana Shield. They are very closely related to the bromeliads, and the plants even look very similar. I don't have a picture of them right now here. Okay, bromeliads, they are rosette plants, all of them, you know that very well. Leaves are in spiral, they're very often succulent, most of them. The margins are often toothed, they have spines or teeth, with the exception of the tillandsias and related stuff, they have that. They have water storing tissue, which is very interesting and relevant to this talk. They have trichomes, particularly developed trichomes called peltate trichomes, which allow them to collect water and nutrients. They have particular stigmas. I'm not going to talk about them. The capsules, the fruits are either capsules with wind-borne seeds or gravity-dispersed seeds, or berries, which are mostly dispersed by birds or a few of them by bats. The seeds often have appendages, cotta, and particularly with the Tillandsioideae, that's very important because those appendages are the feature that allow them to be wind-borne. Okay, so those are bromeliads. There you have a neurogelia and some other neurogelia hybrids. You have a dicea here, which is very beautiful. So that's a typical bromeliad. Most of them have this water-storing tissue. And here you have an Acanthostachys, for example. That's a transversal section of a leaf on Acanthostachys. And you can see this is water-storing tissue that allows that species to grow as an epiphyte. This is the tissue that stores the water. Those cells are essentially empty, function like a sponge. They capture the water and hold fast to it. That's a picture of a succulent bromeliad leaf, probably a dicea or hectia, and you can tell all of this is water storing tissue, which is very important for their survival in the wild, and it's also relevant for cultivation because you don't need to water them that often. As long as that tissue has water, well, the plants will survive without any problem. Okay, then they have those trichomes. You have this beautiful Tillandsia pruinosa covered with those trichomes that allow them to capture water from the rainfall. And something that is also interesting is that in the bromeliads, many of the genera of the bromeliads, the roots are either absent or non-functional because they do most of the moisture absorption through the leaves, through the trichomes. Those are the famous peltate trichomes, which are typical of the bromeliads. They are very variable. These are Tillandsia trichomes. These are trichomes from Picarnioides. They serve the same function. Those from the Tillandsias are much more efficient, and you probably know that. And fruits are essentially capsules or berries, and they carry seeds that are either gravity dispersed, probably a little bit help with this by these wings to be some sort of short distance windborne, or like in the Tillandsia, they have those long feathery appendages that are carried by the wind and taken very far away from the mother plant. They also have those water storing tanks. Not all the bromeliads do, but many of them do. And that plant architecture is very relevant to survival as epiphytes. And it's relevant for cultivation. If you grow bromeliads, you know that the trick to their successful cultivation is to keep those tanks full of water. There you have one of those water tanks. That's Neurogelia kotzki from Espírito Santo, Brazil. You know, you have to keep that full of water most of the time. Okay, so something that is very relevant for both orchids and bromeliads are these two features, epiphytism and succulence. Those two features or characters go together, and it's not only, here you have an orchid with succulent leaves that is an epiphyte, but you also have here a hectia that grows as an epiphyte, and you also have a cactus that grows an epiphyte. So they all share a combination of features that allow them to grow as epiphytes. And understanding epiphytism will allow you to grow these plants. Both orchids, bromeliads, and even cacti and some other plant groups function or behave as functional epiphytes or functional succulents. Being succulent allows you to grow as an epiphyte. And then most epiphytes are succulent in some way or another. Okay, so what does it take to be an epiphyte? Okay, there's several features I'm going to talk about. The epiphytic environment requires of the ability to quickly capture moisture that is only in nature available intermittently. So what adaptations are associated with that? Well, the laminose roots that allow them to capture water very fast. The water impoundments you find in lots of bromeliads. The succulent tissues that are present both in orchids and bromeliads and cacti. The peltate trichomes allow them to capture water very fast. Okay. The epiphytic environments also require the ability to hold fast to moisture, to the water they capture. Wait. Somebody was calling over the phone. Okay. Let me get rid of my phone. You tend to forget that you have your phone in your pocket. Okay. The epiphytic environment requires the ability to retain the water because the epiphytic environment is intermittently dry. So that's why lots of epiphytes, particularly bromeliads, have water impoundments, and you know that very well. They have succulent tissues. Both orchids and bromeliads and all their epiphytes have that. They also have the cam-type photosynthesis. I'm not going to talk extensively about that, but it's a system that allows them to open stomata at night when they would dry less quickly. And that's very useful for epiphytes where water is not available all the time. You have to hold on to the moisture you have. Okay. The epiphytic environment also requires property rules adapted to the dispersal to the branches of the canopy. Because when you see a bromeliad on the branch of the tree, a natural question would be, who planted that bromeliad there? Nobody did. They reached that position on their own. How did they do it? Well, they have airborne seeds like this Tillandsia here. Or seeds that are dispersed by birds or seeds, or by birds or bats. Okay. It also requires the ability to survive with very few nutrients. It's easy to imagine that if you grow on a branch, there won't be many nutrients there. So epiphytic plants, by necessity, have to be slow growing. There's not enough supply of nutrients for them to grow fast. They also have to have tissues or structures, leaves, stems that are long-lived, because every time you drop a leaf, you are dropping nutrients along with it. So they tend to last a long time, and then before they're dropped, the plant sucks all the nutrients out of them, out of the tissue. Okay. They also use the seed pollination, which is very important because most plants that grow as epiphytes can't allow themselves the luxury of giving away water and nutrients as they would do if they provided nectar or pollen to the pollinator. So lots of epiphytic plants deceive the pollinators. They deceive them. Okay. The very few epiphytes that actually provide nutrients to their pollinators usually have impoundments that capture debris and water, allowing them to sort of, give away nutrients and water. Okay, they also have mycorrhizal associations, which would allow the seeds that have no nutrients at all with them to germinate. They have those peltite trichomes, and they are very efficient in the way they deliver the pollen. In the orchids, particularly by having those pollinia that are strategically positioned on top of a pollinator. Here you have an Euglossa analis with a pollinaria of Coriantes from southern Venezuela. So instead of having the powdery pollen, which you usually find in most plants, even in bromeliads, the orchids have this pollinia that will allow them to be very conservative with the pollen. Another feature that is common to epiphytes is that they're vegetatively small, because branches and twigs are not usually long-lived. So, for example, twig epiphytes, many orchids, there's several thousands of orchids that grow on twigs. They have to develop very fast and be tiny and weightless to be able to occupy the twigs. If they were bulky, they would probably break the branches. And you can see that in the bromeliads too. Many of the tillandsias are very tiny. For example, this Tillandsia ionantha. Okay. So those are adaptations to epiphytism that are very relevant to the cultivation of these plants. Okay, and I'll show you a little bit of evolution, which is also interesting to know. This is a cladogram of the Bromeliads. I'm not going to talk about, how we constructed this cladogram. The only thing I want you to see is that most of the basal clades of the bromeliads are terrestrial. And epiphytism evolved later on. Tillandsias here, and then the Bromelioid. Here it would look as though the Tillandsias are sort of primitive. But you can turn this cladogram around, and the Tillandsias will show up in the upper part of the cladogram. Anyway, the story is that first bromeliads were terrestrial. Same with the orchids. The first orchids, these are the subfamilies of the orchid, the banidioids, the orchidoids, the apostasioid, the cypripedioid orchids, the banidioids, and the orchidoids. They're all terrestrial. And even the epidendroids, the subfamily to which most of the known orchids belong, are terrestrial too. It's only the higher epidendroids, which are probably 60% or 70% of the family in number of species and genera, which are epiphytes. Once both bromeliads and orchids invaded the epiphytic habitat, they sort of exploded evolutionary and invented all that diversity, morphologic and floral diversity. Okay, there's other plants that are also epiphytic. I'm going to show you just 2 or 3 of those families. For example, peperomia in the Piperaceae. There's approximately 2,000 species of peperomia, most of which are epiphytes. Here you have Peperomia obtusifolia. You also have here orchids, that's Speclinia grobii, and here you have Tillandsia variabilis, growing together on the same branch. Cactaceae, there's a whole set of clades, of groups within the Cactaceae that are epiphytes. Very interesting that, you know, when you think of cactaceae, you think of plants from dry areas with very bulky succulent tissues. And the fact that they're succulent allow many cacti to grow as epiphytes. So, for example, this is part of the trade of cactaceae, which is restricted to northern Central America. That is an epiphyte, the Amia textula. And here you find it growing with Tillandsia related to fasciculata, and these leaves are from the Tillandsia. And the Speclinia is here. And these are the gorgeous, huge nocturnal flowers of this cactus. So lots of cactus, lots of cacti grow as epiphytes. You know this family, the Gesneriaceae. And this is the most famous Gesneriaceae of them all, Streptocarpus ionanthus, the African violet, as is commonly known. Lots of Gesneriaceae are epiphytic, both in the neotropics or in the paleotropics, mostly in the neotropics. And they tend to have succulent leaves or succulent stems, which allow them to grow as epiphytes. This particular plant, Streptocarpus ionanthus, the African violet, is not actually an epiphyte, but it grows on rocks, which for all practical purposes is the same as being an epiphyte. Okay, so I'm going to show you now this final section of the talk. Orchids and bromeliads growing together in the field. Now, remember, I am an orchid specialist. Most of my photography is oriented toward the orchids. So you will see pictures of orchids with a few bromeliads making a cameo in the picture. This particular picture you're looking at here was taken by my wife. And she's a bromeliad specialist. She actually intended to photograph this Mesoamarantha. I'll show you the picture, this same picture later. Okay, so orchids are associated with bromeliads, so bromeliads are associated with orchids everywhere in the neotropics. And I'm going to show them growing together in several biogeographical areas of the neotropics, where they use different strategies to survive. And for example, in the Guayana Highlands are areas where it rains a lot. There's lots of rock exposed, essentially sandstone, which is very nutrient poor. So there are lots of plants, particularly orchids and bromeliads, grow as lithophytes or epiphytic or over the rocks, surviving with very little nutrients. And that's one of the reasons why many of the Guayana Highland bromeliads, which are very beautiful in themselves, are very difficult to grow. They're hard in cultivation, any of them. The same happens with the orchids. They tend to be very difficult to grow. Here you have on the top of the Lima tepui, you have a Limania, and I don't know what Limania it is. And that's a genus that is very seldom seen in cultivation, if at all. But the flowers are gorgeous. And this is an orchid, Octomeria. That's a large South American genus with many species in the Guayana Highlands that grow on the bare sandstone. So here are the flowers of one of these Octomeria species, and these pinkish ones are flowers of an Utricularia that also acts like an epiphyte. Okay, here you have an epidendrum, Epidendrum holstii, named after somebody you know very well, Bruce Holst, from the Mary Shelley Botanical Garden, who is a bromeliad specialist. And there you have Cornelia, which is a genus, bromeliad genus, with extraordinarily beautiful flowers, but it's hardly seen in cultivation. It requires acidic, nutrient-less water, and it's usually difficult to grow if you use tap water to water your plants. But anyway, so it's seldom seen, but there you have a site of them growing in the field. Here in the bottom, these bromeliad-looking plants are Rapataceae, that other plant family I told you that's endemic to the neotropics and is related to the bromeliads. Okay, again, on the top of a tepui, that sandstone, here you have a Picernia, probably Picernia stenophylla or something like that. And this is an encyclia. We intended to picture the encyclia, but the Tillandsia was in the foreground and, you know, the Picernia, so it was unavailable to make a picture of it too. This encyclia, when we found it, it was a new species. We eventually described it as Tillandsia aujantepuyensis. That was, picture was taken on the top of the Aujantepui, one of the most beautiful tepuis, from where Angel Falls fall. Okay, here you have in the lowlands, but still in the Guayana Highlands, it's a new species of epidendrum related to Epidendrum stanfordianum. It will be called probably something like Epidendrum igneosicolum, to stress the fact that it grows on igneous rocks, in this case, granite. And there you have in the background, you have this Picernia pruinosa. That's a beautiful Picernia that is also seldom seen in cultivation, but that one is actually easy to grow. There's some other epiphytes here. There's a peperomias growing there. Okay, tropical dry forest. The tropical dry forest seems like the most unlikely place to find orchids and bromeliads, but there's plenty of them growing there. And here they show at their best their adaptations to epiphytism, and plants coming from those environments would probably be the best to grow in areas like San Diego. For example, here you have an encyclia growing on the rocks in a very dry place in the Guayana, and you can see here Picernia pruinosa, the same species you saw in the previous picture, growing exactly in the same place. That Picernia grows on rocks. So if you read the description of that plant, most people would assume that it's a terrestrial bromeliad, but it's actually an epiphyte or a lithophyte, which is the same as an epiphyte, but only growing on rocks. That's a picture I showed you before. That's Epidendrum cilioccidentale, and Epidendrum endemic to southern Mexico, southward into Honduras. This picture was taken in Honduras. This plant here is Mesoamerantha malverni, one of the, it's a segregate genus from Hectia. As you see, it grows on rocks. So for all practical purposes, it grows like an epiphyte. Here we grow that Mesoamerantha as an epiphyte. There's more bromeliads there. Here are the leaves of a Tillandsia. I'm not so sure what species it is, but it's a large Tillandsia, something like Tillandsia streptophila, but probably not that one. Here you have Tillandsia shediana, growing along with Encyclia denocarpus. Some of those pictures will feature Encyclias because that's a genus I've been working during the last 15 years. This area is dry, very dry. Look at the agaves here. That's agave filifera. And that Encyclia grows both on the rocks or on the trees, the same as the Tillandsia here. There's also Mammillaria growing here. Look, I don't know what species it is. Mammillaria scripsiana, probably. This is epiphytism at its extreme. An orchid and a Tillandsia growing on top of a cactus. You can't really be any more epiphytic than that. That's very, very, very dry. They have all the adaptations for epiphytism, water storing tissues, succulent tissues, vegetatively reduced plants. This Tillandsia concolor, it also works as an impoundment plant, not as big as Briseas or Usmanias, but they also accumulate some water on the impounds, the spaces between the leaves. Okay, again, encyclias here, I intended to picture the encyclias, and then there's a Hectia here, which is an endemic undescribed species. I will be described by my wife eventually. This picture was taken in the Chamela Biological Station in Jalisco. It's very dry too. Okay, this is in Nisanda, a place in Oaxaca, which is really extraordinary by the amount of succulents and epiphytes that grow there. There's a share of them here. Look, that's Tillandsia concolor. Here, these tiny spots here. There's one here. There's a few here. That's Tillandsia ramiresiana, recent segregate from Tillandsia ionantha. It is what it used to be called Tillandsia ionantha variety stricta, which is actually a different species. It's not related to true Tillandsia ionantha. Then there's Hectia ismusiana growing here, Hectia rosea growing here, and this is Cyrtopodium macrobulbum. They all grow as epiphytic on the rocks like lithophytes. Any of those plants would be easy to grow in your area because they're able to withstand very long droughts, and they grow like epiphytes for all practical purposes. In the tropical cloud forest, when you think of epiphytes, that's a place where you would find most of the epiphytes. I'm going to show you some pictures on the Mexican cloud forest that they call here mesophytic bosque forests. Here, my wife intended to make a picture of this Tillandsia bourgeois, but then here's Artorrhima erubescens growing along with it. Now there's some other orchids here, pleurothalids, that we can't really see in the picture, but they grow in the same cloud forest in Mexico. There's the Artorrhima in full bloom. That's one of the most beautiful orchids from Mexico. It's very difficult to grow. There's Tillandsia violacea with this pendant, very showy spikes with violet flowers. It's really spectacular, and it belongs to a clade of cloud forest, high elevation Mexican Tillandsia that are not often seen in cultivation, but they grow together with the orchids in the field. In the tropical rainforest, they also grow together. For example, that's Epidendrum galliotianum, and there you have a seedling of a Tillandsia belonging to the Tillandsia fasciculata complex. The Tillandsia fasciculata complex is very interesting in itself. Apparently, Tillandsia fasciculata is endemic to Cuba. Most of the other fasciculatas, quote unquote, are different species. Many of them are undescribed species, as now. And this is one that grows in the Yucatan Peninsula. We have two different entities, two different fasciculata type things that grow here in the Yucatan Peninsula. Okay, there you have Tillandsia variabilis here, growing along with Prostichia ecocrata, which was actually the subject of the picture. You know, in the humid tropics, it's almost impossible to make a picture of an orchid in the field without capturing a few bromeliads in the picture. There you have a few other. That's ornithocephalus. Oh, there's a mistake. This ornithocephalus. The T shouldn't be there. Ornithocephalus inflexus growing along with Tillandsia variabilis in tropical rainforest. This brown strip here is an epiphytic fern that grows along with them. Okay, here in southern Brazil, you have this Jacquiniella species growing along with this Brisea. I don't know what species they are. The Jacquiniella is most likely Jacquiniella globosa. Okay, and this is one of the last slides. When I started growing orchids and bromeliads and became member of orchid societies, you know, we had orchid shows that only had orchids. But recently, you're seeing this new wave of shows where they have orchids and bromeliads together. Now you have also all nurseries that grow both bromeliads and orchids together. We go together, perfect companions. If you grow orchids, you can't escape having a few bromeliads growing with the orchids, and if you primarily grow bromeliads, you most certainly will have a few orchids growing along with them. Well, thank you very much.